What is up, fellow thermonuclear AFers? I am Dan Valley coming at you with another 2023-2024 NBA team look ahead, our penultimate NBA team look ahead. It is the Boston Celtics, who had quite an offseason, and I'm excited to be joined by Bobby Manning from CLNS Media, as well as the Boston Journal. Does great detailed work, especially if you're following the stuff he's going to do at CLNS, between the videos, articles, all great stuff. First time guest. So Bobby, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing?
I'm good, man. Excited to get back into it. It was a long off season, busy one, but I'm all about the games. I'm all about the action. So excited for Wednesday and opening night.
Yeah, it's like it felt like it was a long off season, and then as soon as training camps open, it just feels like it's been a dead sprint until opening night for some. I'm done with preseason basketball. I'm definitely ready to get to some more meaningful basketball, but it's funny how the timeline sort of felt like we were in the off season forever, but as soon as training camps open, it's like this dead sprint.
Yeah, and they've had an intense training camp in Boston. There's been some long practices we've been at, and we of course can't watch practice. So we're just waiting and waiting and waiting for things to open up after. So the good thing is, even preseason games, you're not seeing a ton. But it's some sort of action. You get to look at the starters at least. You get to see these guys for the first time, and then opening night where it's going to all come together for the first time.
Um, yeah, and I have to start before we even get to just sort of the on-court implications, given how much roster churn there was for them, looking at acquisitions and departures. What do you think was sort of the overall message telegraphed by this organization? Was it, was it a matter of the opportunities that were in front of them? Did the Jaylen Brown Supermax with the Jayson Tatum's next deal sort of looming push them to kind of make more aggressive moves this offseason? What was just like, was it more about, oh, we need to be offensively versatile? Was it like, what was just the overarching motivation behind everything they did this summer?
Yeah, I think all that comes into play. Of course, you want to see a shakeup after a disappointing season, a year as a whole that I felt never seemed right with some of the losses against bad teams, and going down 3-0 to the Heat just wasn't acceptable. Even with the comeback effort that they made. There were a couple Gabe Vincent injury here, the putback in game 6, a couple fluky things helped you get to that game 7. Then you got blown out in game 7. So changes were coming. Grant seemed like he was out the door from the start. So you needed some front court help. I think that's a lot of what the organization talked about over the summer when it came to their pursuit of Porzingis, a guy that they've obviously liked for a long time, that had interest in coming to Boston. So it all made sense in that standpoint. And I think shaking up the core is something they were interested in. You extend Brown. I think they want to make this Tatum Brown thing work. And this is going to be that real test this year, having put pretty much the best team you can imagine around them now, even better than some of the last couple of teams that were pretty good too. And you have a real offensive presence in Porzingis now, who has blown me away this preseason. I wasn't super sure about that move at first, but you add in the Holiday trade, which I think addresses some of what you lost with Marcus Smart, and I think everything makes sense now. Everything came in to focus. And as you mentioned, there's some implications in terms of the money, trying to add salary, trying to add talent before these new restrictions come into place that make it difficult to do so. You can't imagine a better offseason than this team had here, not only with the top tier talent they added, but I think they added some intriguing guys on the bench too, despite not having a ton of money or resources after to do so. And they have it all. They can play a bunch of different ways now. They have numerous matchup issues offensively for teams, and you've seen in the preseason. There's still a few questions here or there, and we'll get to those. But to answer your original question, I do think they felt the need to shake things up a little bit. And it's no mistake that Smart goes out the door as part of that, that some new faces, talents come in, and coaches too. A couple of good coaching hires behind Joe Mazzulla, and there's a big year for Mazzulla too, of course.
So do you think that, I think the national media or even just fans like of the league who aren't necessarily following the Celtics day to day, do you think that then they're overselling sort of this decision to trade the cultural touchstone in Marcus Smart? And was that especially the players they acquired in Porzingis and Holiday, it's not surprising they were interested in them. It's not surprising that they went after them. Was it at all surprising when you look at who they gave up to get them, where it was finally moving on from Marcus Smart, even including Robert Williams III in the Jrue Holiday deal? Did any of that stuff kind of catch you by surprise?
Yeah, trading Smart definitely shocked me. I thought he would continue to be a cornerstone guy for this team. I thought he played the best point guard of anyone on the roster last year and over the last couple of years here. Defensive Player of the Year 2 years ago, of course. So I don't think that loss is oversold. And if they didn't end up acquiring Holiday as they did, that would have been a major question for me this year. Where's the leadership come from? Where's sort of that physical on-ball defense come from against some of the better offensive talents in the league? The defensive organization, of course, something Holiday's talked about himself picking up now since he arrived here. So that was a big loss, I felt like. And I didn't love the move initially just because I didn't think there was a clear production behind him or replacement for what he brought to this team. Fortunately, the Holiday thing came out of nowhere over the last couple of weeks here, and they addressed it by making that move, which if you were thinking of a smart upgrade, Holiday would be the first guy I think anyone would mention in terms of stepping into that role. So I think the thing when it came to moving on from Smart, and a lot of the perception when it happened was, oh, the Brogdon trade fell apart, so they had to scramble and throw Smart out there to make this work. I think there's a real chance that even if the original Brogdon trade went through, they would have looked into moving Smart a different way. I don't know if it would have been Tyus Jones or some other piece coming back from Memphis. Memphis, of course, said after the fact that they had had conversations about Smart going back a little while, well before that night. And I think it's just inconceivable that that trade came out of nowhere with an hour to spare on the Porzingis stuff. So I think there's been consideration for a long time about where Smart's future goes with this team. He's been such a institution there and someone that both Brown and Tatum have looked up to and deferred to at times. Yeah, I think part of this move, of course, too, beyond adding a major talent that they really like in Porzingis, was opening the door for Brown and Tatum to really have full reins on leadership and ball handling and everything across the board when it comes to running this team, and having no real challenge to that or feeling that they have to, accommodate the longest tenured player on the team here. I think that was all a factor here. And I think Smart's going to be amazing in Memphis. I still think there'll be some moments this year where you're like, oh, they kind of miss Smart a little bit here. Like someone's going to speak up. Things aren't going great. But I think the time comes, he's dealing with an abdominal injury now going into camp. I think injuries are something that's really plagued his play, Smart that is, in recent years. So maybe it was the right time. I still think the move's up for debate going forward, whether it's the right move or not. But of course, that move too helped you do the Holiday trade because the Warriors pick you got back, and that ends up going out in the Holiday deal. So I like it all now. If you asked me this a month ago, where Porzingis is in, Smart's out, I wouldn't have liked it as much. But again, Holiday really solved that issue, I think, of what's going out the door in Smart.
Yeah, I tend not to be too inflammatory, but I absolutely killed that Porzingis deal before the Holiday trade. I didn't like the idea of like sort of diluting your playmaking when that was your biggest need for a risk in
Right.
Porzingis. And I'm like you, the Holiday trade definitely helped it make more sense. I do still admittedly count myself as just like a skeptic of Porzingis. And so my question to you is I acknowledge how good he was last year. Like he was hitting turnaround jumpers. He was scoring efficiently at every level, even though he doesn't get to the basket a ton for a size without being especially ball dominant, yet still being able to punish mismatches. And you're looking at where he's getting the ball and the shots he's hitting. What do you think is the biggest impact he's going to have on this team offensively? Like what's the biggest thing that he brings that they needed?
I think an easy target. You talk about some of the playmaking concerns here. And I think when people think about playmaking, it's that point guard on the ball, and he's making all the decisions and finding guys right in their spots. I think especially in the modern NBA now, and Joe talks about all the time, finding the mismatches and advantages are really what playmaking is all about now in the league, especially where guys are switching and screenings, just creating mismatches and 2-on-1s and stuff like that. It's going to be so much easier for Tatum and Brown rather than scanning and saying like, oh, Grant's over here, Smart's here, he's open, Horford's over here. You got a 7'3" guy who's probably going to hit the shot when you pass it to him. So more often than not, when Tatum and Brown are on the ball, it's going to be find Porzingis. He's probably open, or he probably has an advantage after the screen here. And you've seen it in preseason. Like you, I came into this a little skeptical about the year he had, his ability to stay healthy, how fresh he is after so many injuries in his career. But he's blown me away. And yes, preseason, bad competition, all the rest. But even just watching him in practice, I mean, he hits everything. Every three he puts up goes in. It's a beautiful form. He's got that great mid-range release as well. You talked about the post improvement last year. We haven't seen a ton of that yet, but against smaller guys, it's something he's capable of. I've been very impressed by him. 20-9, of course, in the last game. The 3-point percentage is going to just go through the roof. I said if he doesn't shoot 40 this year, the only reason will be because he's taking like 10 a game. And, he's just below that 40 mark. But he's a real element that they've missed. Robert Williams didn't have much of an offensive game. Al Horford's offense mostly just came from spot-up threes. So you didn't have a presence in the pick and roll that you could throw to and make stuff happen with. And Porzingis has shown a little bit too when it comes to that topic of playmaking that he can make a quick decision if guys really close out on him. So it's a real third playmaker. And one of the reasons I came into this skeptical too was, can he step into a third role, a third option role behind Brown and Tatum? And I think he's even done a good job with that, just trailing plays, shooting quickly when he gets the catch, attacking the offensive glass. I think he's done a great job with too. So it's just an element they don't have. And especially, I think Tatum's come a long way as a passer, but for Brown, who receives so much criticism for the turnovers in Game 7, when he's out there with the second unit, a spot that they really struggled in last year without Tatum on the floor, I think for him to just focus, and he even said this after last game when I was talking to him about it, if he can just focus on get Porzingis that ball and go from there, it's going to be a huge plus for these guys, turning the ball over less and being less stagnant offensively.
Yeah, that was I had two main, well, I guess three when you include the playmaking, but one of the other three was, would it be difficult to get him to buy into, a number 3 role? And at times it could be just the amount Jrue Holiday might have the ball in his hands if you're playing all 4 of them together. Is it technically number 4? And then I saw some of his comments. I think you actually posted them, or was a video in your article about, I've never seen him talk like that. I've never seen him seem so introspective about how he was kind of didn't, I guess like I don't know that he used the word immature, but was just talking about how he didn't understand certain things earlier in his career. Now he gets it. And so I guess just from what you're saying, that doesn't sound like fitting him into the larger offensive ecosystem doesn't sound like it's an actual concern anymore.
No, not yet. And we'll see where that goes. I'm sure there'll be some frustrating moments and games where things don't go their way. We even saw a stretch in that last game against the Knicks where they got a little stale offensively for about a quarter and a half. So that stuff will still happen. I think turnovers are really something they're going to have to avoid here to make everything work. But Joe keeps stressing the best way to avoid turning the ball over is just finding an open shot quickly and taking it. And that's something Porzingis, I think, is capable of doing. He's going to get a ton of shots. He's going to be a major factor in this offense. And we haven't even mentioned it. The one thing, for all the doubts we both had about him, the one thing I said when he came in is that he's going to be a defensive force. The way the Celtics play defense, dropping their big back, having guards who can really navigate screens well. I knew he'd be incredible. And he just had a great season with the Wizards defending pick and rolls. And man, he's out there. I don't have the numbers because they haven't done a great job tracking them in the preseason, but it feels like he's contested 1 million shots in these games. Guys are probably shooting below 40% against him inside. That's what it's felt like just watching it. Had a couple more blocks last game, but it's not even all about the blocks. He's deflecting passes in the pick and roll. They were even pressing last game, and he was getting up, making things happen in the press. So I'm blown away. He moves better than I thought he did. I thought there probably will be situations where if he has to get out to the perimeter to cover screens and shooters and stuff, it's going to be a challenge. But you have Horford. If you got to do that, he's a better defender against that. Having a 7'3" guy in that drop rather than Horford, who's probably 6'8", 6'9", not really a rim protector, world of a difference for this team defensively already. And I think he's going to have a monster year on that end. Offense, I think, he's going to make shots. He's going to produce on that end. But defense is what I think many people question with him in the past. But in this system, the way this team defends, he looks like a natural fit. And it's simple. Like, he just has to guard those screens, stay back against the rim, and defend, contest shots. And he's done a great job of it so far. I've been super impressed by his defense.
Yeah, I think statistically he's been one of the best drop coverage defenders for the past couple years too.
Yeah.
And before I ask more about the defense, just really quickly in the offense, is there any element of, okay, now you traded away Malcolm Brogdon, who for his position, and I think in large part thanks to Boston spacing, he got to the rim a little bit more than people realized. Robert Williams III was kind of that guy who could put pressure on rolls and cuts and slips and whatever to the basket. Is there any concerns about losing that element? I know you bring in Jrue Holiday, but like Porzingis is not necessarily a rim heavy big. Like when he's picking and popping more than he's necessarily going to pick and roll, or he might pull up out of those plays anyway if he is going downhill.
Yeah, you'll stagger quite a bit and have those impacts into the second unit. I do think if you're looking at it in a vacuum, they'll miss Brogdon based on what he did last year. Yeah, he scored half their bench points pretty much. He was a constant with that unit. The one thing I'll say about Brogdon is I've never seen a player, in my years watching the Celtics who shot so consistently night to night. Like, he wouldn't have many like 2 for 10s or 1 for 7s. It'd mostly be 4 for 8, 5 for 10 every single night. And that was a huge part of their second unit production. And he didn't play make a ton. He was more focused on shooting and scoring. I think that was the role they expected of him. But he was so consistent with that role. And so who's going to the second unit? Who's filling that bench role? That's the biggest story I've been tracking in preseason. And maybe Holiday, who more and more reports and stuff I've heard too seems to be pointing toward him at least starting the year on the bench or going to the bench in certain games. Maybe he can fill that role, playmaking, ball in his hands, all the rest. I asked him if starting's important to him, and he said, no, I just want to win. And it's more about who closes than who starts. And I think the whole team's embracing that a little bit. So, Rob, I always imagined a more fully formed, effective offensive player when it comes to Rob. And I think many people dreamed of that. You saw the passing. You saw him stealing guys sometimes in transition. The roles were incredible. But he never got involved often enough. Guys didn't look for him enough. There never seemed to be a well-established connection between some of the playmakers on the team and him. And I thought sometimes he just floated around and didn't really have a involved role offensively. I didn't think he was the best screen setter either. Like, Robert Williams' offense always left more to be desired. Great putbacks, great offensive rebounder, but that can't be your offensive game pretty much, especially if you have another center in Horford out there who's mostly limited offensively when it comes to scoring too. So, there's some depth questions on this team for sure. Cornette's a guy who's going to have to give them a few minutes. Hauser really struggled to start the preseason, and you wondered if there's going to be some competition for his spot. He closed the preseason so strong, and, we'll see him again tonight as we record this. I think he's got a pretty good hold on his position there. But what you did in trading Smart and Grant and Rob and all the other guys we've mentioned here is limit your depth a little bit. And how important is depth? We'll see. And I think that's becoming more and more of a question around the league. Like, how much of it is top-end talent to win a championship and how much of it is depth? I think Denver, as great as their top-end talent was last year, really had some solid depth that contributed to their championship run too. So I'm interested to see how the Celtics strike that balance. They have a lot of candidates to provide some depth here in the second unit. And if Holiday is going to embrace that role and they roll with him for the whole year there, I think that could be interesting. But for now, you're betting on the top end talent. You're betting on the new guys who are really, you look at some of the top 100 lists they're putting out there so far, much closer to Brown and Tatum than some of the supporting cast was a year or two ago. You're betting on that swinging this team closer to the title, even if you're not getting Rob off the bench or Brogdon's scoring off the bench like you did a year ago. Because, as great as those things were, Dan, nobody looks at last year and says that was a great season. They were awesome last year. Everybody looked at last year and was like, what the hell is going on? So they had to change stuff, and they did.
And I guess this kind of puts a bow on the Porzingis discussion. The two things I'm wondering what changed. You already sort of alluded to the defense. Do we see any changes to how Boston defense, where you already mentioned that maybe they've been bringing him up higher. His hip mobility, as soon as he went to Washington, I don't know if they made him do yoga or something, but he just improved his hip mobility a lot. Do we see them be more aggressive with him, or is it because you might have, when he's healthy, one of the most dominant just drop coverage rim protectors in the league, that you're going to be even more aggressive? I think they finished after a slow start like 7th in opponent turnover rate. That could we see them be even more aggressive up top and trying to force those issues?
Yeah, they're going to feel it out. They've done it a lot in preseason, tried different things. The zone over the summer, I kept a big eye on that because they played so much of it in summer league. They tried it out a little bit in preseason in spots. I'd be asking guys and they'd be smiling. They didn't really want to say some of the stuff they'd be trying out behind the scenes here. But I don't think that's something that's going to come into play in a significant way. But Joe keeps talking about finding a curveball, other defensive looks they can go to, ways to throw teams off their game, because he thought defensively, especially last year, they had a system that worked, but they really didn't have stuff to adjust to when they got a little stale or ineffective on that end. So they're going to have something that they throw out there that surprises people at some point. I think a lot of the stuff we've seen in the preseason has mostly been experimenting, but bringing Porzingis up, using him in a variety of coverages is something Joe wants him to do. He said it's not just going to be drop here. He's got to be ready to do a lot of different stuff on that end. And we've seen that from him so far. They haven't gotten too crazy with the way they've used him as he's adjusted to the system so far. I think they've kept it fairly simple in the preseason. And they, frankly, playing the Knicks twice and all that, a team that they're going to play on opening night, I don't think they've shown everything that they're going to use when the real season starts, especially since they've sat guys in games too. So I think a lot of the defense is yet to be seen here. I think they've been hammering that this camp rather than last year, mostly focusing on offense. And I've said it, I think they have a real chance to get back to number 1 in the league defensively this year. It's going to look different. I think they're more focused on covering space, navigating screens for the guards. As you said, Porzingis playing back and manning the middle, wings, covering space and trying to cut off passes and stuff like that, I think has been a big deal too. They want to increase the turnovers this year. I think the biggest thing you saw between that finals defense and the defense that ranked well last year but didn't look that forceful or disruptive was the amount of turnovers they forced. They were way up there in 2022. They were in the bottom 10 last year in terms of turnovers forced. So they're going to be scheming up different ways to do that. And having Porzingis on the back line, as you've mentioned here, is going to allow the perimeter players to get a little more aggressive on the ball, take some risk, and try to force those turnovers. You saw Holiday do it, if you watch that Knicks game early, by cutting off a pick and pop to Sims and just, kind of cutting that passing lane and jumping out of his coverage there, seeing that they were going to do that. And having those really smart, long, impactful guards that they do between Holiday and White is going to be a big part of that.
Yeah, now that you said it, I don't know where I got they were 7th in opponent turnover rate from. They're actually 26th. That's a brain fart on my end. So like the consummate pro that you already answered most of my questions on Jrue Holiday. And the bench stuff is interesting because does that sort of imply that they want to ensure he's going to have enough reps on the ball, and maybe it makes it a little cleaner if you're staggering him from some of the stars to make his fit right away, or even just if you look at him offensively, what do you think is the biggest difference going from Marcus Smart to Jrue Holiday, essentially?
I actually think it's going to be pretty similar. That's what Jaylen said, at least when I asked him about it. A secondary ball handler who they're going to go to a little bit more in crunch time, I think, is how Mazzulla's described it, making that comparison. But throughout the flow of the game, it's going to be a lot of ball handling by committee. I still think Tatum's going to be a major part of what they do there. And I know that freaks people out, but every star in the league is pretty much their team's primary ball handler. More or less. So the ball is going to be in Tatum's hands a ton, and it's still going to be on him to make good use of it for them to win a championship. And if he's not able to, then they might not be able to do it. It'd be great to get him off the ball more, and I'm sure they're going to do that throughout the flow of games. But at the end of the day, for everything to work offensively, you got to have the biggest threat on the ball a lot of the time, and that's going to continue to happen here. Fortunately, Holiday, mid-40s% catch and shoot guy, so they're going to find him and he's going to knock down shots there. I think the biggest issue with Smart, and this is definitely one to go back to that conversation a little bit that this team looked at here, is in crunch time, the ball was going to Smart. Defenses were saying, we're going to sell out on these guys and make sure that ball funnels to Smart because he's going to shoot those threes. And those are the shots we want this team taking here in this spot. And you look at the numbers in crunch time over the last couple of years here, Smart would be their shot leader in some of those close and late situations, above Brown, above Tatum. Even Horford, I think, was above the two stars in the way that teams force them to, give shots to certain guys. That's going to be tougher to do with Holiday, who's been a pretty good shooter throughout his career, can make good decisions on the ball. I think his screening's really been impressive too. But it's, he just got here 2 weeks ago. So I think that's part of the thinking here is helping him continue to acclimate, making sure White's a starter. The Horford thing's interesting too, because obviously last game you start White, Holiday, Tatum, Brown, Porzingis. And I think most fans look at that and say, that's your best five. Horford's getting a little bit older. Send him to the bench. You really don't have a backup center if you're starting two bigs who you can rely upon in any matchup for big minutes, even though I'm a big Cornet fan. So I think most fans want to see that be the starting five, but you lose your double big looks when you're doing that. Horford, I've said it over and over again, he's only come off the bench 14 times in his career. He looked good doing it against the Knicks, which encourages me a little bit. I'm sure they'll do that on certain nights, and Joe continues to really emphasize the starting lineup's going to be by committee. There's going to be a lot of different starting lineups this year, and guys are going to be resting and stuff too, so that's naturally you're going to create some different starting lineups here. I don't think it's going to be like Brogdon for Holiday this year where he never starts games. It's going to be 6-man every game. I don't think that's going to be the case for Holiday, but to start the year, help him continue to ease in a little bit, give him some added ball time, as you said. When Tatum's off the floor, Jrue can have the ball in his hands and Brown can continue to play off the ball with him. And I'm sure Porzingis will stagger into some of those lineups. You can really have an effective second unit without Tatum on the floor, which this team has never had in the time that Tatum's been their star. So I think that's all part of the thinking there. You're going to have some nights where Horford comes off the bench, I'm sure. White is super willing to do it. So if it comes down to just personalities and management of ego and stuff like that, I think the easy move is to send White to the bench, but you can't do it. Like, he was too good with the starters last year. He's been too good in the preseason. He's maybe your best defensive player all around, at least
He was
according to
certainly that for them last year, right? Like that was the
So like, as much as he's like, I'll do it, I'm the good soldier, I'm fine off the bench. He looked at his best playing with their best players last year, and you got to continue to keep letting him play as many minutes as possible alongside those best players. So as easy as it'll be for Joe to make that move, I think you really got to keep White out there as a starter. So again, I said it on the Garden Report after last game. If I had to predict the starting lineup on opening night, I think it's going to be White, Brown, Tatum, Horford, Porzingis, and Holiday's going to come off the bench, which doesn't mean he's going to play 10 minutes. He'll still play 30 minutes off the bench, but it's just in terms of the rotations and how they're starting games. And everybody says it doesn't matter how you start the game, it's how you finish. And Holiday will be out there to close every game.
Yeah, even as the reports have come out or like the comments when he was, I didn't buy it. But I mean, you're saying it, so I'm gonna have to buy it. And I am overall whether he's playing against second units or I'm looking more so, he's a good shot maker during the regular season. His splits in the postseason have been so bad, even dating back to Milwaukee's run. I am so interested to see though, not just maybe being nudged down in the pecking order a little bit, but like Boston spacing, he will probably be with 3 to 4 above average shooters at their positions at all times. That is spacing he did not have in Milwaukee. And you can even look at some of his 3-point shot quality metrics. Like, it just supports that how difficult his role was. And so whether you're starting him, whether you're bringing him off the bench, it feels like they are streamlining his functionality in a way that could be devastating to opposing defenses, because it's just the Holiday we've seen. I mean, maybe his shot leaves in the playoffs, but like, this is someone who's been hitting step back jumpers for a few years now, like these contested step back jumpers. And now you don't need to use that as a crutch. You're going to have more room to attack in the middle, or you just might be getting wide open threes you weren't in Milwaukee. I'm so fascinated to see how his offensive efficiency and just game changes regardless of how the Celtics are going to use him, because of just the half court spacing environment they're set to put him in.
Yeah, it's similar to Porzingis, right? You're captivated by how much more space these guys will have to operate apart from the Jays. And I said that last year when Brogdon arrived. He didn't have the best shooting year with Indiana that last season he was there, but it's like, all right, he's going to be shooting wide open shots every time here in Boston. And he had a 44, 45% 3-point shooting year. So Holiday's definitely capable of that. Porzingis as well. It's going to be tough for teams to stay away from anyone, to overcompensate against anyone. And they might have to do that against Porzingis, especially if he's going to play that inside game against some mismatches. And that's going to lead to some easier shots for Brown and Tatum, too, to go back to that conversation. So you really have release valves everywhere for this offense, shot making everywhere, a little more flexibility offensively, too, when you think of the stuff Porzingis can do inside the arc. Tatum at the rim, too, has been posting up more this preseason, I've noticed. So you're just going to really be pressuring teams. When I talk to opponents throughout the league last year, with last year's team, it's like, this is a tough shot making team. Like, they're able to make shots where you defend them great, you feel good about what you did, and they just make a ridiculous step back three, as you mentioned there, or just a fadeaway or whatever it might be. And now you're adding two of, as you said there, even tougher shot makers with Holiday and what he's capable of doing, even as a first option on a team. Some nights in Milwaukee, he was really able to get his shot off. Porzingis is the Wizards' top option on a lot of nights, a ridiculous shot maker. He has this move, and he did it against the Celtics last year where he's dribbling around. This is a 7-3 guy, dribbling into a step back three, fade away and nailing it against them. And he tried it the other night against the Knicks, and he just barely missed it. And it's like, if you have to defend that alongside Brown and Tatum, it's going to be a long night. And I know some teams are already saying, like, what the hell are we going to do against this much offensive talent here? And credit to Joe, who I think has gotten a lot of criticism, and rightfully so, to quote Marcus Smart from that playoff series. He's really drilled offense, and as this becomes more and more of an offensive league, having that best offense by and far away, the Nuggets did it last year, is really the ticket, it looks like, more and more to winning a championship. I still think you need that high level defense too. Not many teams have won championships without a top 10 defense or even higher. But they have the capability to do both of that here, which I think is really why this team's going to be a pretty good bet to win the championship. I'm not shying away from Denver. If you really made me pick today, I think that's the way you lean, just because of what they're running back with here, Jokic's superpowers. But a Denver-Boston championship series, especially with Porzingis in the mix now as a big man against Jokic, it's going to be a lot more captivating than it was last year. Say the Heat won, or the Celtics won Game 7 against the Heat there. I think they would have lost pretty quickly against Denver. And this time it'd be a much longer, more competitive series with what these teams have now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the top 6 for each of these teams are the best in the league, too. When you look at, depends maybe on how you feel about Christian Brown and Denver, but Boston just, if
Right.
everyone's healthy, they have the best top 6 in the league. Jaylen Brown, I've seen a lot of optimism on the timeline about him. He's ripped. We've seen videos of him, dribbling with his offhand. Is that still just the next frontier for him? Can he tighten his handle or improve upon the turnovers or be a more consistent playmaker? At one point it used to be, can he deepen his shot making armory? And he's done that. And like each and every season, it seems like he's added a little bit to it. Do you trust that he has the ability to kind of hit that next gear of, can you diversify your handle or be more of a consistent playmaker? Or is it, okay, looking at how long he's been in the league, like he might just be closer to what he is now than waiting for him to continue to add on?
Yeah, I think the better bet is accentuating what he is now rather than completely changing it. He's been in the league a long time now, since 16, 17, and you haven't seen too much improvement on the ball handling front. There's been some spurts of it, but for whatever reason, I know there was a lot of talk coming into the league about his hand size or whatever it is that really prevents him from being that great tight dribbler. Every player is going to have a weakness, and if you could shore up all your weaknesses, you'd be the best player in the league, and this is just going to be that thing that holds him back, it seems like. So instead of becoming, Pritchard with the handles, it's going to be about him making good decisions on the ball. And last game especially, he had 6 assists, 4 turnovers. You see where he's able to get off of it quickly and find an open guy and pass out of the traffic that's really coming to pressurize him on the ball. And you see situations where he just gets stuck under the basket doing a little too much and tries to throw it away, and it ends up in the other team's hands. So for him, he started doing it last year, and it really led to the All-NBA season he had. Being an off-ball scorer for him is going to be super important. Hitting threes. He's had a few down seasons from 3, and improving in that again, I think, would really help him. Being a quick finisher, better screener, I think is something he's worked at too, because especially now, you mentioned Holiday, you mentioned Porzingis. Those are two guys that are going to cut into his ball time a little bit here. So there's going to be much less time for him on the ball, and that could be to his benefit. I know he has aspirations of becoming a better playmaker on the ball and running pick and rolls and all that. But if that's not your strength, focus on your strengths, which are finishing, shooting off the catch. You can break guys down from mid range, and you're still going to want that to be part of your arsenal. And a lot of his turnovers, as high as those numbers are, I think come from him being aggressive. One of my favorite things about Jaylen is against the best rim protectors in the league, your Evan Mobley's and, all the way down the line, Rudy Gobert's or whoever it is, he's able to just go in there against those guys aggressively, knock them off their spot and finish. And if you're turning the ball over a little bit doing that, I think it's worth it, because for Tatum and some of these other guys, when they've gone up against great rim protectors, it has really made the offense stale. And I think those have been the nights where Brown shined most, where he's able to knock those guys off their spot and open up that lane for the Celtics. So, he's much maligned, much criticized after the last year. There'll be a lot more scrutiny with the contract that's coming up for him too. But when you focus on the things he's great at, which are still a huge benefit for this team, and realize that you're going to have to deal with some of the weaknesses that come with that, I think you're able to accept and embrace who he is as a player and how it helps this team. Now, you'd love to see him tighten up the ball handling a little bit. It got out of control in that East Finals series to a point where it was just killing the team. But you can live with 3-ish turnovers a night, given what he gives you there. Now, the defense is another story. I don't know what's going on with that part of his game the last couple of years, getting lost off the ball and making mistakes on that end and just looking unfocused on that end of the floor. He has great length, really strong. Even early in his career, felt like he was almost a defensive specialist. In the last couple of years, he's let that slip. So as much as everyone's going to be focusing on the ball handling, I'm focusing on the defense this year, because that's more just about effort and consistency and being dialed in, rather than the ball handling, where there might be some physical limitations or, whatever's caused that. So if he has a great defensive year and he keeps talking about it, I think that's going to make the ball handling mistakes he has more acceptable for me.
I wrote to you in the outline that Jayson Tatum has just reached a level of stardom where I don't really have any interesting topics to bring up about him, just because he's such a known commodity. But you mentioning that Jrue Holiday is going to come off the bench, is that, I know they have the connective tissue of Derrick White, Al Horford then in that starting lineup. Is that a vote of confidence, though, in his ability to drive the offense as a passer, which he's improved upon over the past few years, gotten better at like making those quick decision, no dribble touch passes, or the assist that he threw to Jaylen Brown. I can't remember what game it was in the preseason where it was
the
like
last one
in the corner, just like, so like he's just able to make these more complicated reads. Is that among many of the other factors that goes into bringing Jrue Holiday off the bench? Is that also kind of a vote of confidence in Jaylen Brown? Jayson Tatum, the facilitator, though?
Yeah, and that's inherent. I keep saying it. A lot of people want to see them bring in like a Chris Paul or something to just organize this thing and run it. It doesn't happen as much anymore, and you don't really have those guys who are going to come in and run an offense alongside stars like Rondo used to do, or whoever it's going to be. The ball's got to be in your best player's hands, and he's got to be able to pull in the pressure of the defense and make other guys better away from that pressure. And so if the ball's in his hands less often, it's going to be less opportunity for him to, take on some pressure and dish the ball and create some mismatches as he can do on the ball there. I like his pick and roll production. I think the numbers were decent last year without having them in front of me. It's just about consistency for him, cutting down turnovers too. He can be a little bit of a mess out there too on the ball at times, though he's made some real strides in that area, as you mentioned. It just has to happen, and you only get better by doing it more and more. So I think it only makes sense that you're going to push him to do it more and more. And when late game situations come up, the ball is going to be in his hands. It's just how it goes. It's nice to hear that there'll be a little bit more of an outlet out there in Holiday, and I think it's going to be important for Tatum and Brown to know that and empower him, because going back to the Smart thing, I felt like there were times late in games where they could defer to him a little bit more as a creator, but they just didn't for whatever reason, trust or shot making or anything down the line you could say about Smart there. So the biggest thing for Tatum as a ball handler is trusting his teammates, especially with the teammates he has now. You don't have to be this great orchestrator. again, back to the Porzingis point, you just got to find him. A lot of the time, that's going to be your read, is just finding Porzingis. So it's simplifying things for these guys. And is Tatum ever going to be an 8-9 assist a game guy? Probably not. But if he's making the right reads, moving and keeping things flowing after that, keeping up the pace of this offense too, I think is so key for him. He's just such a naturally slow moving player offensively on the ball that I think that's another thing that pisses off fans, is that like things just slow down with him. But it's all about just continuing to improve in that area. For Tatum especially, he's only 25. Guys really don't hit their stride, their prime, until 26, 7, 8. So that's the big thing you're still looking for from him. You know he can be a great defender and shot maker and scorer, and even his finishing's come a long way. He draws a
Yeah.
million free throws every night now. It's just that playmaking, and you need it to happen. I keep saying it. If he can't figure that out, they're probably not going to win a championship with him, because I mean, how many? Giannis, I guess. Even Giannis really made some good strides on the ball, and he's a center. So centers are kind of that exception, that you can be the roller and create out of that,
And that's
rather
what he
than
did
being.
too during that title run. He was more of like sort of a play finisher than put him on the ball and have him run this show.
Yeah, and that you don't have that luxury here, because he's really not a center, and Brown has to do that, right? He's got to be that play finisher. So Tatum's got to be the creator a lot of the time, and that's just how it is, and that's how you structure your team with him as the star. Not many teams can say our star is going to play off the ball and it's going to be someone setting him up all the time. You know, I can't really even think of it. Maybe Philly last year with Harden and Embiid, but you saw how that went. So he's got to be the, point forward, for lack of a better term. That's just got what he's got to be here.
I think I don't know if I'm more optimistic than most, but I'm optimistic that he gets there. I guess the biggest question for me would be, when you mentioned when he kind of slows things down, I also feel like that's how he sees the court the best. Or I think
Yeah.
last season he did a better job of throwing those like touch passes. It's, can he make quicker live dribble decisions and be less predictable on his drives? Whereas, yes, he's a very varied shot taker and maker, but you kind of also know sometimes when he's going to take a shot, like when he's operating on those quicker dribbles. And so I'm curious to see if he can improve like his live fast dribble playmaking, not back to the basket or like breaking down defenses more methodically. And if he does that, like it would not shock me if his assist. I know you said he'll never be an 8 assist per game guy, but it wouldn't shock me if his assist totals jump by like 2 or 3 from last year, and he was at like 4.5 or whatever it was, 4.7.
Yeah, and my question too, and how much can Holiday help this when things get stale, when they go into some of those droughts, which were still their fatal flaw a year and even the year before that. Where do they go? Can he be the guy who breaks them out of that? Does Holiday start to help them solve that a little bit more? Can he really jump out there and command the ball? Because that, to me, is still where this team is going to have its championship hopes made or broken. How quickly can you get out of those droughts, those lapses offensively, those stretches of sometimes 8, 9, 10 possessions in a row where they're really not getting anything going? You have some better shot makers now. You have an array of better playmakers. So it comes down to Tatum and Brown. Can you trust those guys? Can you get off the ball and make stuff happen off the ball after you make that initial pass, for Tatum especially? That's going to be what I'm looking for this year.
With Brogdon gone, I had assumed that Derrick White was going to be the one coming off the bench. You mentioned at some points he might. And so my question was, are the Celtics going to need him to be more of an aggressive scorer this year, not having that Brogdon type there? I think putting him in the starting lineup would insulate him against needing to play that role. But does what they need from him change? I think it changes more offensively than defensively, but does it change at all just based off the new makeup of this team?
They need him to be aggressive. They need him to be a shot maker. He's still that guy, or he's now that guy, rather, that defenses, I think, are going to funnel the ball toward a little bit more. And luckily, he is so downhill driven. Luckily, he is such a willing screener that he's going to shake loose, and he's a good finisher. Last year, he had an exceptional 3-point season. I'm interested to see if he can replicate that. His shooting coach, who he primarily worked with last year, and Ben Sullivan's gone. So I'm interested to see if that can keep up, that 40% consistency from out there, because he's had a lot of ups and downs in his career as a 3-point shooter. And if he lapses a little bit, it's going to be easier for defenses to lean away from him. Now, in that awful game 7 that everyone wants to forget, there was the one silver lining of that stretch, I think in the third quarter, where White got super aggressive and looked like a central offensive creator in that game. A guy who can create off the dribble for himself and make good decisions on the ball for others. He's always had that in him. He's not your prototypical point guard. He's going to flow and on and off the ball, more of a combo guy. But he's just such a smart and effective playmaker that if you put the ball in his hands or involve him in a play, something good's going to happen, whether he's shooting it or whether he's moving it. And of course, he should be remembered always for the Game 6 putback. It's just the embodiment of how smart he is as a player, the way he read out that play. And you look at his turnover numbers too; they're so low. It just reflects how good of a decision maker he is. So the more you can empower him on the ball, I think the better you'll be. Again, he's so willing to sacrifice. He's such a team guy that he doesn't always imprint himself on the game. He's more willing to set that screen or space or whatever it might be for the other guys, which is helpful. But sometimes you do, as you said, need him to get aggressive and be a big shot taker because he's so capable of it. Even from 3 last year, he was so good. So I see him more confident, White, over the last year and change here. Becoming a father, becoming comfortable in Boston on a winning team, a starter. It all comes into play there. And you saw him really hit his stride in those playoffs. So I'm not worried about him. He's probably the guy you worry about least here in terms of what he's going to bring to the table. But it's just about staying consistently aggressive if you're him. Even speaking up a little bit more too. I talked to his trainer over the summer, and in that leadership conversation we have, he's one of the more elder guys who's been here the longest now. So he's got to be willing, especially as a fellow starter, to point something out to Brown and Tatum, to get them in the right positions defensively, if that's what it is, to just speak his mind on stuff, because a lot of the leadership here is coming from the players on this team. They've added some good assistants. Joe's becoming more confident this preseason, you can tell, but this is a players team, right? They don't have this big coach with a lot of pedigree who's been around forever, who's going to set everybody straight like Ime did. It's going to be a lot of the players figuring out stuff on their own. So yeah, Tatum and Brown are the leaders now, and it's got to come from them. But you're also going to need your Whites and Porzingises and your Holidays of the world to speak their mind too when it comes to it. And especially for White, who's been playing for these guys for a couple of years with these guys, I think he's in a better position to do that. And he's talked a little bit about doing it too. And he's so naturally shy and quiet and to himself that I think it's going to be an adjustment. But especially if you're a starter, if you're one of the longest tenure guys on this team, you got to be a vocal guy to some degree. And that's going to be something else I watch with him this year.
With Holiday, if he does come off the bench a ton, is Payton Pritchard still this team's 7th most important player, or does that role shift? What do they need from him this year? And then who is after him? Like, who, looking at their depth, their role players, like who becomes the next most important player after that top 7?
Yeah, I think to go back to this last Knicks game, you're going to see, I think, what Payton Pritchard did in that game be his role more than some of the flashier, high-scoring games this preseason. I'm sure, if guys are sitting out tonight, we'll see that from him again. His acclamation of being an off-ball shot maker, an active player away from the ball, is going to continue to dictate his success. And there might be some nights where he plays a little less often to allow those top 6 guys to play together more often, especially in the playoffs. But during the regular season, allowing him to play more often and acclimate to that role, which they haven't given him a ton of time to do throughout his early portion of his career, even though he's a career 40% guy from 3. That's going to be key to this team developing depth and having him ready to step up if needed. I still think you look at Pritchard and say he's probably still more of a if needed guy than every night 20, 25 minutes a game guy when it matters. But he's shown that he's capable of these things now, surviving defensively, making shots away from the ball, making quick decisions away from the ball. And you want to see him get more involved in some of those team areas too, like screening and moving and making the right cuts and all the rest. And I think he's shown all that this preseason. He looks a little stronger too. And he can create off the dribble. Not the best playmaker on the team, so I still don't think that's going to be a massive part of what he gives them. But he's just ready to contribute now, I think, which if that's 10, 15, 20 minutes a game is helpful because you can't have everything, right? This team has a big top 6 that's high paid, that's star-studded. So you're going to need your Pritchards of the world to go down the line like you wanted. Hauser, another big year from him, shooting 40% from 3 is all you really need from him, surviving defensively too. Cornette, a guy who I like, who fans, I think, misunderstand.
We know
playmaking.
Brad Stevens loves him.
Yeah, playmaking, setting the right screens, and defending the rim. It's all you need him to do. And now you have an array of guys down the line here. Stevens, a defensive specialist. Mihailuk, a shot-making specialist. I think these guys are probably much further down the depth chart than it seemed this preseason. Even Jordan Walsh, I thought he might make a impression and break into the conversation here, but it seems like he's going to be more of a main guy this year. So it really is about the top 6. Then you're looking at Pritchard for all the things I mentioned. Then you're looking at Hauser for the shot making, and then you're looking at Cornet for the rim protection and passing and what he brings. So if this team's fully healthy, I think you have what you need. But when you're a little less reliant on depth, suddenly an injury strikes, especially in that front court, to bring it back to Porzingis, the concern we have with him, the health.
Yeah.
If he goes down for a week or two, all of a sudden it's 30, 40 minutes of Horford at center, a lot
He's
more
getting older. What
Cornet.
happens if he gets injured during that stretch too?
That's where you start to get a little worried with this group. And I do think they've minimized their injury risk a little bit, even buying into Porzingis. White's a guy who stays healthy, played 82 games last year. Holiday throughout his career has done so. Tatum's never hurt. Brown has a week or two every year where he's kind of out of the mix, but mostly healthy. So I think that concern's been minimized here, but you do have a team, I think, that's a little more susceptible to having its championship hopes thwarted by an injury than a year ago where you have Rob to step in or Horford and vice versa. And, Smart and White and Brogdon, if anything happened there, Brogdon's in the mix. Last year's team was definitely better suited to sustain a loss than this year's team. But fortunately, you have fewer injury risks across the board here. So that's the balance they struck.
That's a great segue into the end of the podcast, which is the cookie cutter portion of the podcast. It seems like you outlined there are 9 locks for this rotation. If you had to pick like sort of a 10th guy that sneaks in there, is that like an Oshae Brissett? That probably has the best chance of doing that.
I love Oshae. I covered him in college. Didn't have the best preseason. I think it's Stevens. He's on a training camp deal. He hasn't played a ton this preseason. But to me, that reflects less, he's on the bubble and he might not make it here, and more, we understand what this guy can do when he's out there with the best players. And so we really don't have to see him as much in these tryout spots because he's not a player who's going to shoot a bunch of threes in the fourth quarter of a preseason game and really wow you with shot making like a Mihailuk did for stretches here. Brissett, I think a lot more of his game's going to be predicated on shot making than Stevens, who, I've talked to a lot this preseason and says, I can play some 5 if needed, small ball 5. I can make shots. I can get involved in the screening actions. And we know what he's capable of as a defender from that top-ranked Cavs defense last year where he started 25 games. So I'm still amazed they got him on a training camp deal. He's going to make this team. I think there's going to be times where, maybe someone's missing for a little bit of a stretch. You just need a change of pace where he's going to come in. And you saw in the first preseason game, he puts down this two-handed slam, putting the ball back in against the Knicks on the road. He had 3 offensive rebounds. The shot is really a point where he struggles, and that's the reason you got him on the minimum deal, to answer my own question. He really struggles to shoot. And, that's the name of the game now. So this isn't going to be a guy who plays night in and night out, but it is going to be a guy who I think you need in spots here. And it's going to end up being one of the more pleasant surprises of this offseason was bringing in Lamar Stevens, who I think is going to have his moments this year. Oshae, we'll see. Again, struggle shot making this preseason. I think he's more one positional defensively against 4s than Stevens, who can guard a bunch of different positions here. So we'll see how that goes. Mihailuk, amazing preseason shooting the ball, but man, do teams go after him on the defensive side. And it's going to be tough to play him, even with, the backline help that we've mentioned here. Nice to have him in the mix. Nice to have him on a minimum deal, but probably not going to be a guy who plays a lot this year, especially with Hauser in front of him. Walsh, again, what I'm hearing is it's going to be a lot of main early on for him as he acclimates to the league. Queta, people are excited about him, and I won't rule him out, but in your dress rehearsal last night against the Knicks, he didn't play a minute. So, again, a guy on a 2-way deal who's probably going to see some time in Maine here. But if we're mentioning guys who could break through, Stevens and him, I can't deny what he's done this preseason, Queta. He's probably closing in on Cornet more than some of these wings are on Hauser. So keep an eye on him. Active, moves better than I thought he did. A huge body at 7 foot 250. I've liked his game out there in Sacramento, a top 5 G League player last year in that mix for MVP. Another guy where it's like, all right, we'll take him on a 2-way deal. Why not? So they have a lot of options here. I like the offseason they had. I said it at the beginning. As much as the Jrue and Porzingis additions are really some exciting things here, you do have some guys lower on this roster who do intrigue, who do bring a bona fide NBA skill to the table. I'm interested to see if Gabriel makes this roster. He didn't really play at all in the preseason. Wasn't around for much of camp. He's kind of a late addition. You have 15 guys right now. You can carry an open spot into the year. He's on a training camp deal too. So do you carry him into the year, sign him, or do you just let him go after camp here and keep some flexibility open with that 15th spot? I think they might end up cutting Gabriel here. Not that I've heard anything about that, but if they want to have an open spot into the year, save some luxury tax money, all the rest, I think Gabriel would probably be the guy who ends up let go out of camp here, but we'll see.
If we fast forward to the end of the season, and I know that this will probably be matchup based for them a lot, but what will you expect to be their most leaned upon crunch time unit? And kind of as a follow up to that, do you expect that they're going to tilt now that they've traded Time Lord? I know they might start Porzingis and Horford together a bunch. Do you expect them to still just lean more so on the one true big lineups rather than trying to cobble together as many dual big stretches?
Definitely, especially I think Mazzulla is a guy who likes the smaller looks better. And he did a great job coaching that mix last game when that was the starting lineup. So I think that's how you're going to close games. I think Horford's probably going to sit more often than not in those closing lineups, especially given his one-dimensional offense at this point. Good passer, but mostly just spot up threes, as we've said. That's fine. There might be some bigger teams where you go double big against them late. If you're going more defensive down the stretch to try to hold a lead, that might be the way you go too. But more often than not, I think it'll be Holiday, White, Brown, Tatum, and Porzingis. Though I'm still interested to see what happens when they face a Warriors type team, a team that's really going to spread you out, that's really going to pull the center out to the perimeter. I think there'll be some situations where Porzingis might have to take a seat late in games in those situations. Okay. If teams are really hammering them from the 3-point line with those screen and pops, Luka Doncic, even a guy like that who's just jumping around screens and hitting threes from deep. The interesting thing too, Milwaukee, obviously the main competition is going to be doing that with Lillard and Giannis. Can Porzingis cover those pick and rolls? There's not going to be any center in the league that shuts down that combination. But I feel like I'm still higher on Horford than most fans, where I've really seen him guard out in the perimeter and switch onto ones in ways that not many centers are capable of doing. And I know Trae Young gave him a tough time in that first round. Who wouldn't have a tough time as a center in that spot? But he can just stay in front of guys. He's so used to playing the perimeter defensively, and he's so used to navigating screens for this team that I do think there'll be certain games where you do close White, Holiday, Tatum, Brown, Horford, so you can switch everything. That's not something I see Porzingis doing as much, switching 1 to 5. He's not a guy who's going to guard many guards effectively on the ball. So, there'll be some games, I think, where Porzingis has to take a seat and Horford's out there to close. But again, the buy-in that we've mentioned on this show, guys being willing to come off the bench, guys being willing to play fewer minutes. Porzingis, as you mentioned, more surprising than anyone maybe in saying that, like, if my stats take a dip this year, if I got to do this or that to sacrifice, I don't care. I want to win. So having that buy-in this year is a little bit of difference versus last year, where I think Grant falling out of the rotation really just threw him for a loop. You had a guy like Smart, who I think expected to be out there in crunch time, given his pedigree on this team. Of course, it was a starter night in and night out. Not as flexible, I think, in his movement between the starting lineup and the bench as some of these guys will prove to be. And then minutes, of course, too. You kind of knew what you had last year. And this year, I think you can be a little bit more flexible with those minutes. So Mazzulla is just really more empowered this year, I think, to make some decisions in all these different spots we've talked about, right? And he's got the assistants backing him up. You bring in Jeff Van Gundy for even more added perspective. I mean, if you're Mazzulla this year, I think all the excuses people used for Mazzulla last year were all valid. Coaching staff that didn't really sign up for coaching alongside him, and many of them left over the summer. Great assistant in Damon Stoudemire leaving in April, and that really was a demarcation point for them going into some of their more inconsistent play into the playoffs after he left. Losing Will Hardy, losing Ime, all that stuff, and especially not having a whole summer to prepare for the job.
Right.
He took over
Yeah.
2 days before camp. Those were all valid excuses to me. You never hate to hear excuses. You never like to hear excuses for a team of this caliber, but those were valid to me. And now this year, I don't think there's any excuses. He had the summer. He's had all the personnel he needs. He's got the assistants. So there's some pressure on Mazzulla to get off to a great start here, right? And show that he's capable, because he did have those moments last year where you really question him. But he looks more confident to me. He's deploying a lot of interesting schemes, especially on that defensive end, as we've talked about. He's got guys working with players positionally, like Cassell with Tatum, and Tony Dobbins is back, who's done a lot of work with Brown, and Charles Lee's here, who coached Holiday in Milwaukee. So it's been nice having him to acclimate Holiday to this system too, that Lee's been a part of all summer. And those guys are going to be there to, I think, probably make some suggestions to Mazzulla, give him some perspectives that he might not have had last year. And I'm coming in this year high on Mazzulla. I really am. When the East Finals ended, I said, if you really made me pick one way or another, bring him back or let him go, I'd probably lean let him go, because I just think he struggled that much in the playoffs last year.
Oh,
But
wow.
I said, if you really believe in him, if you like at his core what he's capable of as a coach, and you're willing to support him, I can accept him coming back because of all the excuses we just lined out. Like, they were all valid. So, I mean, if they were going to move on from Mazzulla, my top choice would have been Charles Lee. And he's here as an assistant. So why not have both?
Is there a weird or wacky lineup that maybe they won't try, but you think that they should try, or you just are morbidly curious to see?
It's funny. Brad mentioned it, and I think he was joking at the Porzingis introduction. Oh, so, Rob's not even here anymore. But it was funny. You mentioned Rob, Horford, and Porzingis playing out there together. That would have been interesting. 3 bigs on the floor in certain spots
Can
just
we
to
throw
throw the other
Cornette
team
in there
off.
then? Play those
No,
three bigs?
you know what? Why not, right? Let's go with that one. 3 bigs on the floor, Porzingis at the wing, Horford at the 4, and Cornette down the middle. Maybe that'll be something we see. I don't see it. It'd probably be something smaller, right? Like a White, Holiday, Tatum, Brown, and another wing out there, like a Brissett or something like that, to really go small, really run, really defend 1 through 5. I think that's probably more likely than seeing Cornette out there with 2 other bigs. So, yeah, if something wacky was going to happen, I think it'd be 5 small guys out there. Stevens, too. Could he play a little bit of small ball 5 for them?
Yeah.
Tatum's never really been a guy who I think is fit in at the 5. To throw it back to 2020, I still think that was the fatal flaw of that team, is that you really couldn't go small with your 3 wings and 2 guards that year. So there's only so small you'll go with this team, I think. But again, if there's an injury to that front court and you don't have an immediate reinforcement ready to come in, they're going to have to do some more innovative stuff with small ball, I think, to make it work. And that's going to be part of Joe's job this year, is making that stuff happen, especially when injuries strike. So that's still the one thing that could really hurt this team and throw them off their path, as an injury to a key guy like Porzingis, or even a Horford, I think, would really hurt this team at this point with their flexibility. So, yeah, it's going to be on Joe to experiment a little bit and see what he can do with this new look roster throughout the year. And I'm excited to see it.
Yeah, you outlaid mine. I want to see Tatum, Brown, White, Holiday, and then throw Pritchard in there for me. Like, let's really
Yeah,
boost
go
the.
super small, right? And that's something Joe, I think, is open to. He loves going small. He loves spreading out the floor, really stressing teams with their offense. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see something wacky like that at all.
As we record this to wrap up, it is October 19th. Their win total over under is set at 54.5. Would you take the over or the under on that? And asking where they stack up in the East isn't really interesting because they have a very high floor in the East. But are there any, looking ahead to the playoffs, are there any teams or matchups that are either particularly intriguing to you or maybe even particularly problematic for this team?
So to answer the first question, it's a high number, right? It's probably the highest in the league, over under, or right up there.
I believe it is.
So usually when I'm approaching those, and I'll probably pick mine soon, all the over unders, I'd lean under, just because I think they're setting it high and stuff can happen. And, you want to be a little more conservative with picking some of the high numbers. But for this team, I think I'll actually go over. Just the energy coming into the year, all the personnel they have, a relatively weak East, and their ability to win games with guys missing last year really flashed. I forget whether they went over or under last year, but they won a lot of games with starters out. They almost beat the Bucks with pretty much none of their starters playing in that game last year up there. So they're good at that. I think they'll steal some wins here or there where you don't think they're going to win, and they'll probably just edge out that number. So I'd go over if I had to pick one way or the other there. And in terms of matchups, I can't wait for next Friday against the Heat. They didn't get
Okay.
Lillard. They didn't get
Yeah.
Holiday. Holiday would have really scared you if he ended up there. They didn't even get Brogdon yet. I'll keep an eye on that one. But they're coming in with Jimmy and Bam, and it's all these unsung guys like Cole Swider. They're really excited about in camp and what he's done so far. And you got your Jamal Canes and just guys no one has on their radar right now. A couple of rookies and Hawkes and Jovic, who's effectively a rookie, spent most of last year in the G League. Are they going to surprise everybody again? I ruled them out early last year when they stumbled coming out of the break, and then they made the finals and they beat the Celtics going up 3-0 on them. So it's still a little bit of a boogeyman for Boston. I'm sure it's still a team that's going to challenge them when they play them just because of how great the coaching is on that other side. And Jimmy and Bam is as effective as they are on both ends of the court. I think that's going to be an interesting team if you run into them in the playoffs. It's going to be a team that you really have to overcome. And, I use this analogy all the time. But the Patriots for so long struggled with the Ravens. It was just a team they really couldn't get past. Always seemed to beat them come playoff time, even though they were the worst roster. But then they had that game in 2014 where it was a shootout. It was back and forth. And then the Patriots finally overcame them. And you never really heard about the Ravens when it came to Brady again after that. Could this be the year you finally discard of the Heat? It'd be big for this team and this core going forward into the future to do that. Having Porzingis against that zone is going to be a big plus. He played well against the Heat last year, even though he didn't particularly shoot well. I watched a lot of film of Porzingis against the Heat. But it's still a team and a matchup that's going to always challenge the Celtics more than you think. So I come into this year with full respect for the Heat, despite losing Strus, despite losing Vincent in this matchup in particular. Now, are they probably still going to be scrapping and clawing to get into the playoffs? Given the roster they have right now, I think that's how it's going to go for them this year. But that still puts you in April of, the Heat are down there at 7-8 and the Celtics are up at 1-2. Look out. Because I still think that's something that's going to scare Celtics fans a little bit after the way last year went. How could it not? And luckily, they get to play them on Friday, opening night, so we'll get an early look at that.
Yeah, I didn't even really think of that one, but that's a good one. The Bucks, obviously, not only because Dame and Giannis are there, but because the Bucks kind of helped create this version of the Celtics by not
So
controlling.
here's my thing with the Bucks. I obviously would have said them, but before we recorded this, Terry Stotts stepped down, which was weird.
That was
And
bizarre.
and the big thing is Middleton not being ready for camp. I mean, that would scare the hell out of me if I'm a Bucks fan, because with their depth, I don't think they can beat Boston without Middleton.
Well, the other thing that's just interesting from a storyline standpoint is the Bucks patted themselves on the back to the point they might have dislocated their shoulder for not, putting Jrue Holiday's name in the public. One, I think if you give a player notice, that allows them to brace themselves for a trade. And two, by going that route, they weren't able to control the team that ended up with Jrue Holiday, and now he's on
Right.
the Celtics, so they kind of help create this beast. And then the other team, the Cavs would be fun. There are a lot of good teams. There's just looking at the makeup and how small they could technically play at points. Nets versus Celtics would fascinate the hell out of me. I don't know
Really?
if
You
the
like
Nets
the
are good.
Nets going in this year?
No, I don't like them as an overall team. But as they match up against the Celtics, where you have Dorian Finney-Smith, Nick Claxton, I think is like all defense caliber. They brought in Dennis Smith Jr., who really juices up their point of attack defense with Mikal Bridges there. I just think they can run some maybe one or two problematic lineups for a lot of really good offenses in the NBA. So I would just be curious to see
And
it.
they
I
have a
don't think
good
you get.
coach. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but I like that you bring them up because Joe's told the story a couple of times. Everybody remembers the game last year where they went up 28. The Celtics did against them and then blew it in just unbelievable fashion. And Joe keeps saying, he said it a couple of times. I knew we were going to lose that game because they were taking the 3-pointer away from us. The Nets were just jacking threes like crazy to try to get a 3-point attempt advantage on Boston. And the Celtics built that 28-point lead with layups and shots around the rim. So he's like, we're not going to keep hitting these shots at the rim, and we're losing the 3-point shooting battle here. So this game's going to flip against us, and it obviously did. So Vaughn talked about it too after that game. He was like, you got to take the 3-point volume away from this team. You got to take those analytical edges away from them. And that's how you beat Boston. And they methodically did it with a roster that, again, last year wasn't all that great after the Durant trade. So they're a smart team. Bridges is going to have a monster year. I think he should probably be the favorite for most improved. And like you said, they have some real defensive pieces out there. And even as a guy who's probably about as low on Simmons as anyone else, this is it for him, right? That's the only intriguing part for him going into this year, along with the health that he's talked about, which you have to believe now too. If he has a year like the last year or the year before that, they'll probably waive and stretch him, and that'll be the end of his career. So he kind of has to come through this year to extend his career, at least in Brooklyn. So there's really a lot for him to play for this year, and that intrigues me a little bit, even though I'm not counting on him turning into the old Ben again.
You've been more than generous with your time. Is there anything else, strengths, weaknesses, players, any storylines about this team I haven't asked you about you think needs to be touched upon before I let you go?
No, I think we hit it all. I guess the one guy I'll throw out there too, and he played a little bit last game in the dress rehearsal, which I think is telling. Dalano Banton, a young, raw guy who just didn't work out in Toronto, who fans up there like, but the coach didn't really trust him, and Nick Nurse. They get him on the minimum. He's on a non-guaranteed deal with a team option the second year, so they really bought low on him. Joe really likes him, and you can tell why. He had a great game scoring 20 points against the Knicks on the road, knows all the screening actions on this team. He said he came 8 weeks ago and learned all that, so he got super in-depth with the offense over the summer. Really endeared himself to Joe, it seems. A long guy at the point guard spot at 6'7", but a guy who really, really struggles to shoot. And we know how important shooting is for this team. We know how important spacing is. But spacing's not all about shooting, moving and screening and all the different stuff we talk about. He could get involved in that way. And he's a playmaker on top of it as a natural point guard who is still 6'7" and can guard some wings. I'm keeping an eye on him because of all the players we've mentioned, I think he's had the most surprising preseason, just with how involved he's been, with how much the coach has talked him up, and how effective he's looked at times. Now, I asked Nurse about him, when Philly came through last week, and he was like, yeah, he'll look great one game, and then the next game, he's So that happened. He had 20 points against the Knicks, and then the next game against Philly on the road, he didn't dive for a loose ball, and Joe benched him to start the third quarter. So there's still some inconsistency to his game. He's still young enough where you're like, all right, he's probably not a part of the picture right now, but a little time in Maine, an injury maybe, he could sneak into the conversation fast here, just like I said with Lamar Stevens. So I'm keeping an eye on Banton. He's had a great preseason. His energy seems great. He's got a variety of skills and a unique body that I think is well suited to the way this team wants to play on both ends of the floor. So Banton, nice pickup, surprising preseason, and maybe a guy that surprises some people early in the schedule if he sneaks in some minutes. And, the other thing too is there is some wing minutes open here if Hauser goes into a slump. 2 months last year, he shot 28% from three, and they really had nowhere else to go. I think this time around, if he slumps for like 5-6 games, you have a lot of different guys like Banton that you could put into that spot and try something new.
This was great. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. Are you able just to tell our listeners where they could find you and all the great work that you do?
Yeah, clnsmedia.com. Written content there. Of course, the Garden Report after every game will be live tonight as we record this after the Hornets preseason finale for the Celtics. Opening night next week, we'll be down in New York. Boston Sports Journal every weekend, column over there, and Celtics blog occasionally as well. So a lot of stuff out there. Go find it.
The links to Bobby's CNLS media page will be in the YouTube and podcast description, so go support him over there, please. And once more, thank you so much for giving me a bunch of your time, and I will definitely be spamming you again in the future.
Thanks, Dan.